Today we're going to delve into composition and call it the art of composition because it really truly is an art form. Just before we start, I want you to consider what makes the Great Wave of Kanagawa so spectacular from a composition perspective. And how is it that Mondrian's compositions made up entirely out of squares is also a spectacular feat in composition? What makes this image so special? Why does it just hit the sweet spot? How does this scene from Game of Thrones conform to one of the golden rules of composition? How does the work of Wes Anderson to be in a lecture on the subject of composition? And indeed, Western director John Ford, what did he have to offer that relied entirely on a strong appreciation of composition? The same can be said for Paul Thomas Anderson, the director of There Will Be Blood. Again, a master of composition. And what makes these two posters fine examples of composition whilst breaking quite a few of the golden rules. So what we're going to cover today is lots of things, including the rules of third, the golden ratio, golden section, golden triangle, rule of odds, leading space, how to balance elements, leading lines, symmetry and patterns, viewpoints and framing. That's a lot to unpack, but I'll be showing you by example. But first, let's clarify composition by way of a term. The art of organizing elements of artwork into a harmonious and pleasing whole. Effectively, that's the essence of composition. It's the consideration how objects are placed in a design or work of art. Before we delve into the rules, I just want to touch on some fundamental principles by way of 5 tips for just creating good composition before we then go even deeper. So we'll cover overlap, crop, rotate, focal point, and the importance of using off-centered arrangements in your work. So overlap. So when you've got several elements in a composition, they're not in isolation. Their relationship is so strong that they overlap. This is where you place objects slightly over one another. And this helps the eye move from one object to another and also appreciate the meaning in terms of the relationship between several objects or components. You can break overlap down into several components of do's and don'ts. One don't is objects should never appear to kiss. Kissing is not allowed in composition. It creates too much tension between pieces. It's kind of feel uncomfortable to the eye. It can create strong relationships, but you can create strong relationships between elements without them literally touching each other. It's also important that your objects aren't entirely in isolation to each other. That's a really important rule. So that's on the don't do list as well. So kissing, but also isolation, equally unpleasant to the eye. Whereas overlap is a way of creating a strong relationship between your elements. It doesn't mean that every element in the composition has to overlap, but if it's going to overlap, then do a good job of it rather than go half-assed about it and on the cusp of kissing. Take these objects here, the square, the arrow, the line, and the circle. That's considered to be harmonious and pleasing to the eye composition. And we're only talking about shape here. Equally, same objects, just arranged in a different way, using the power of overlap. Again, that's pleasing to the eye. We're only looking at abstract, which is quite handy because it focuses our attention in doing so. Again, same objects, just simply tweaked using overlapping. So that's a simple principle of overlap. Cropping is really important in composition. Consider having objects go off the edge of the page. This gets the viewer in and out of the picture. So if I just show you this image of the objects in isolation, they're all within the frame. But think about how you could add a sense of dynamic by using a simple technique of cropping. So the circle now is massively scaled up and cropped off. What it does is it draws the attention to the objects from outside the page going in. If they were wide, then it would look as if these objects were falling off the page. But as it happens, it looks like they're falling into the page. So that's the principle of cropping. Rotation, or rotate, is a really useful technique. It's when artwork with objects that are perfectly lined up with the edge of the page can be relatively boring. Whereas if you consider placing objects at an angle, things that are tilted create a more dynamic composition. So these objects are squared up and relatively boring in appearance. Whereas the same objects, without changing the size of anything, have taken on a completely new dynamic. And that is a very, very handy technique, given the right circumstances, whether it's an illustration or a magazine layout. In photography terms, it's called the Dutch angle, taking a photograph at an angle to add dynamic to the shot. And then there's focal point. This is really to do with visual hierarchy. What does the eye look at first? What is the eye or the viewer drawn towards as the primary object in the composition? It's really the most important area in your entire composition. Gives the viewer something to focus on. One way to achieve this is through size variations, and other ways to create focus is also through color dominance. So if I just show you again these items in isolation, not one of them in particular draws your attention. And yet, if I just rearrange, now of course the focus is on the star. Now that's called focal point. If any of you are playing with the prospect of creating a collage composition, whether it be photo collage or graphic collage, start with a focal point. If you don't have a focal point in a collage, it ends up looking like wallpaper. And then you've got off-centered. This is avoiding placing everything in the center of the page. Think about placing things slightly to one side or the other. This will create a more interesting composition. Try to keep elements balanced as you do this, though. We've further developed our appreciation for composition by developing an eye for asymmetry and creating kind of off-balanced effects. So this is like symmetrical as it gets. Not particularly interesting. But if we then take the same elements without changing the scale much, now we've got two things in play. We've got the focus point, but we've also got secondary elements. But the position is that it has the main focus point, the star, occupying the left-hand side of the page. These elements on the right-hand side have a way of drawing the attention back. So imagine the star is pulling the attention to the right, and those three elements there are just pulling it back with an invisible rope, creating an overall asymmetric composition. What I want to do, and this even before we go into the rules, I want to show you how composition can add meaning to the piece of work. And I'm going to illustrate it with an elk and a wolf. Both are pretty much center staged. Neither one is more important than the other. And right now they just look like good friends, side by side. So let's, through the power of composition, let's build a relationship between these two elements, and in doing so, add meaning. Let's, for starters, make the wolf bigger. Already, we've added some degree of superiority of the wolf over the elk. And indeed, you've already, just through adjusting the wolf is taking on a character that is preying on the elk. And that was just a simple matter of scale. So let's take it one step further. Let's take it bigger. And when you're playing with scale, my advice is go in equal increments, start small and get bigger and bigger until you hit the sweet spot. So now, same meaning, there's a higher level of intensity in terms of the event, the meaning behind the scene. And we can take it further. We can swap it round. So the difference between these two is that the elk is facing the wolf, so therefore aware of the pending threat. Whereas if you simply have the elk facing away from the wolf, then of course the elk is not aware of the pending threat. So again, that's added meaning and a higher level of danger. We can take it to an even further extreme. We can add depth to the overall composition. So there's a kind of a rule that the further away an object is, the more saturated the color becomes. You'll notice this in a lot of landscape photography because it assumes the characteristics of the atmosphere. Things don't get darker as they get further away, they get lighter. And so the wolf remains solid black, the elk is 35% black, making it grey. And just to give some kind of context, we've added this panel here to give a sense of depth for the horizon line that the elk is occupying. So our two characters, who are initially just stood side by side, are now telling a story, embedded meaning through composition. We can take it further. We can add angle, which now adds the dynamic of tension between two characters. We can use composition to imply the viewpoint. This one shows the scene from the elk's perspective, where the wolf is looking in the background. So again, it's just composition. You can play the scale game, either up or down, to add ever so slightly the relationship between the two. You can also add the angle to add a sense of drama. All these examples are also showing us, giving us an object lesson in balance, how to balance the overall picture. The elk is kind of like pretty big and occupying very much the right-hand side, but the attention is drawn back into the frame with the presence of the wolf. So we're going to go through the rules of composition. And I say the rules because they have been actually devised as such and logged and used and throughout as go-to principles. So back to this list, we're going to go through each of these principles and see how they apply to both graphic design, illustration, and even photography. So the rule of thirds. How many of you are familiar with the rule of thirds? I think it's probably the most familiar of all the rules. Yeah, I would have thought most every one of you. It's really a simple division of the available space that we have. And it doesn't matter what proportion, whether it's a square, a rectangle, horizontal or vertical. As long as you equally divide the horizontal and the vertical axis into 3 columns, you then get the very important intersections. And those intersections are critical sweet spots. They're invisible because you don't have this grid in your finished piece, but you know it's there and you use it. So if we take, say, the rule of thirds, you can take a picture and you can use these lines and intersections to compose your overall shot or your illustration, or even your poster, by simply cropping this picture so that the horizontal line meets our lowest third there, and that the cabin is bang on one of the intersections. And that would be an unquestionable, a perfect picture. We haven't just taken a picture of the cabin in the woods. We're also able to appreciate the context of the whole scene. You've just taken a picture of a lighthouse. Whereas if you add the rule of third and then use the rule of third to recompose it, you completely change the dynamic. So what we can do is we can look at the use of the rule of thirds in art, and there's some fine examples. Take this painting by Vermeer. You look at it and you might think, yeah, cool. But Vermeer understood the principles of the rule of thirds. And evidence of that is that if you turn on the rule of thirds, you can see what the edge of the open door most accurately hits the rule of third. And in doing so, it creates a tension to the door, so much so that your attention outside the room. Bear in mind that it's not just the intersections that are important, but it can often be the squares in between the intersections that can help make up a composition, or a combination of both. Turner's landscape, he had a sense of composition. This painting here of friends in the park having a picnic by Rembrandt is no accident when you turn on the grid, the rule of third. So the main character in the foreground is corresponding to the rule of third, making them the main subject in the picture. And the others, secondary. This is obviously kind of going back onto the principles of giving your overall image a degree of focus, and then secondary, and then third, attention, kind of almost cascading away from the main object. Salvador Dali, again, you're probably all familiar with this piece, probably one of the most famous examples of his work. It's, again, perhaps something that you'll appreciate even more, knowing full well that it conforms to the rule of third. Even Michelangelo and Last Supper understood the principles of the rule of third. So the rule of third in illustration, going back to the elk and the wolf, one of those examples I showed you was actually conforming to the rule of third. You just didn't know it. What we could do, we could move things around a little. So we could go from there to there, and we would still have an appropriate composition. Because if we turn the grid back on, all we've done is we've moved the elk from the center of this third to the intersection. We can play with these characters again. So what we've done is we've changed the viewpoint, that's the angle. We've gone slightly higher. The same image as I have here, yeah. And what we've done is we've lowered the horizon in order to be able to achieve that. Turn on the grid. So again, we put the elk back into the middle of this third, but we've lowered it down to the lowest of the horizontal lines. And the wolf has effectively, he takes on a much more imposing character because he's now even larger than life and overwhelming in the scene. And if that's your intention, then if you're illustrating this amazing moment in your next work, illustrators, then always remember scale and composition will become vital to add to the drama of the moment. So if you take something, like more complicated, like the illustration in a children's book or something, or even a movie or an animation, where you place your elements can have, and there are lots of options, but if you want, you can just use the go-to principles of the rule of thirds to help keep an overall composition looking and feeling just fine, just right. So the rule of thirds in graphic design, quite a lot of book cover designs are adhering to the rule of thirds. It's a very handy starting point. And there's so many things you can do, like that's just an abstract of how you can play with elements and they look, just fine. And this is the same grid, of course, but how these cover designs have been put together using the rule of thirds. You can see where the interjections are, especially on this one here, the top edge of Papillon type graphic elements aligning here and there. There's more examples again, now that you've seen the rule of thirds in play, you can understand how this is this cover design has obviously been designed and composed by someone who's read up on the art of composition. What's interesting as well is that it's a mix of ranging alignments. The headline is dead center, but the overall picture, the background image with man, is off center. And because you're using the grid, it doesn't feel so much like a contradiction. Whereas this one's totally centered. And again, I've left the grids turned on so that you can see how things work around here. So the vertical, left-hand vertical is used as the center line for the main title, whereas the main author information, whereas the title is using the overall center of the piece. The background image is thrown to the right-hand side. Obviously, playing with balance, you can see there's some kind of balance going on between the connection between the motorbike and the character. But even then, the position is kind of in line with the center of his face, just giving it a kind of an overall feeling of it kind of being just right. Then can be said for this one. Notice how close to the intersection the character's eye is. The intention of drawing your attention to this character, not only in this two-third aspect here, but also within the two-third to the detail within the character hitting the intersection. And yeah, the examples go on, and For you graphic designers, it would be really good for you to find examples of posters and brochure covers and generally any novels, and decipher which ones you feel have been designed with an understanding of composition in mind, and therefore kind of work in your opinion, and those that just don't work at all. But generally within the profession of graphic design, you will find that most everything is done with intent, and composition is the backbone of your kind of professional knowledge. So I'd like to think that you wouldn't find many really bad examples of composition in graphic design. And again, using the lines for this single object, where do you put that object? Where do you put the magnifying glass? Well, let the grid design the composition for you. And in terms of posters, you can see the division of the page has been left up to the rule of thirds, and then the design content is applied around it. So rule of thirds in photography. So in many ways, whether you're a graphic designer or an illustrator, nowadays, and you're both image makers, but I think nowadays we're all amateur photographers, except the term amateur normally would have been a kind of a little bit of slur. But nowadays it just means that you're not paid to take photographs, but it doesn't mean that your work can be of an amateurish nature. So it's you know, it's not meant to be derogatory. And the reason for that is because not only do we all have a camera in our pocket and therefore are more practiced at taking photographs, but we also have the option in the settings to turn the grid on and off. And what is that grid? It's the rule of thirds. You don't get many grid options in the standard photo applications. It's either the rule of thirds or nothing at all, because the makers of these phones really can't fully understand why the average person would need more than just the rule of thirds. Of course, there are other rules, but they just don't want to complicate things for you. So like, take a scene, this landscape. It's a bit like where we began here talking about the lighthouse. You take a picture of an object, don't put it in the middle, put it to the left or the right, in line with the rule of thirds. And the same goes for illustrating. It's just like, we're not just talking about photography, but currently now. And so, and it doesn't matter what tree or what time of year, see the difference between these two, is it's using the same principle of composition to make that picture just look right. And again, the position of taking a picture of something and then just slightly shifting it to the left or right just helps you bring the context, add context into the overall image. Whatever it is that you're photographing, what is the context? What is the environment? And it doesn't have to be landscape, it can be, it's like any situation. Something like a close-up. Again, it doesn't have to be a catalogue recorded shot of a what looks to be either a moth or a butterfly, but you can create a composition with the available material and just kind of like bring it to the left or the right, and then use the overall composition of the rule of thirds. When taking pictures of just anyone, really, for that matter. If you want to add draw attention to the person, then put them on one of the intersecting lines. And if that was just a close-up of this young girl on the beach, it would probably, well, it wouldn't be in this lecture, put it that way. It wouldn't look interesting enough to be included. Even if it was just cropped there, it would lose quite a lot, whilst obviously all we've got are, like clear sky and the remains of the landscape and a little bit more of the ocean. And yet, the bigger crop is just giving a much sweeter overall composition. We're going on to another rule called the golden ratio. And it has a lot of similarity with the rule of third, but it's actually based on a mathematical equation of 1 to the power of 1.618, which I guess you'd have to be a mathematical genius to really appreciate what that means. And it's best to actually show by example. It's another division of this. They're not equal divisions this time. They have this shallower center. This principle, the golden section, has actually been used since Renaissance time. This is just almost a rule of third, but allowing a more extreme opportunity to add context to the overall composition. So if we look at, say, art, so we take Botticelli's Birth of Venice here. Venice character is occupying a very slim section in the middle of the shot. You can see how the horizon line is adhering to the grid, but the context, which is the kind of god of love, whatever here, and this character here, are actually as important as Venus because of the overall story. Now, if you'd used an evenly distributed grid, and therefore the power of thirds, you wouldn't simply have the space for this, for these stories to be told. So that's effectively, in very simple terms, why you have that shallower composition when you're telling a much bigger scene. And in Renaissance time and well through the 17th and 18th century, the golden ratio was more common than the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds in many ways is a contemporary rule, whereas this is the classic rule. So the use of golden ratio in photography. So we can go back to our lighthouse and we can show this just using the rule of third, or we can adjust it using the golden ratio. So we'll just move things around, recrop it and turn it on. So what we're now looking at is the difference between this and that. What it's doing is giving us the advantage of putting everything into context, which we had when we were using rule of third. But what it was doing, it was only giving us a one-sided context. By having the shallower nature of the golden ratio, it gives us the opportunity to have a very similar context to the left, but also a reaffirming context to the right of it, without the need to put the lighthouse bang in the middle of the overall context. So if anything, it's making the landscape just look even bigger than before. You can still use it as an overall composer when shooting single objects. So golden section. The golden section, often referred to as the golden spiral, and it has a third term called the Fibonacci sequence. Now, the Fibonacci sequence is actually a mathematical formula, and it looks like this in its visual terms, but mathematically, it looks like this. The idea is that the two preceding numbers, when added up, makes the third. So 0 and 1 makes 1. 1 and 1 makes 2. 1 and 2 makes 3. And 2 and 3 makes 5. 3 and 5 makes 8, and so on and so on. That is what creates the spiral, because it's not just adding, but it's multiplying in scale as the numbers get bigger. So what that number counting does, it's the formula that creates this spiral. So 5 and 8 makes 13, 8 and 13 makes 21, and infinitum, except you can go infinitum in both ways. In fact, you see this golden section or the golden spiral everywhere. It's almost as if it's nature's own composition rule. And it kind of makes you wonder how that's even possible. Because we're not just talking about the arts, we're talking about the environment around us, nature's own grown. And you find it in objects, like a shell. How is that even possible? And that's why we call it nature's own composition. So you see it everywhere, as I say. So in shells, you see it in storm formations, you see it in the galaxy, you see it even on the human body. The human ear is kind of like very, very tightly in line with the golden spiral. So the use of the golden section or spiral or whatever you want to call it, the Fibonacci sequence, how does it apply to the arts and where have we seen it before? So you've got Turner's landscape here with the golden spiral in mind, giving kind of attention to this part of the picture and the character within it. And even the kind of suggestion of the trees getting smaller as they get further away, just opening up the overall context of the painting. Even the Mona Lisa, is a classic example of the golden spiral. Going back to our wave, our great wave, it was modeled entirely on the golden section. So use of the golden section or spiral in illustration, this very kind of Gothic looking scene is on as a play or a playbook, from the same playbook as the wolf and the elk, using the same principles of scale and overall composition. But the spiral is giving us something very different to the golden section, and that is kind of an opportunity to kind of like have the eye drawn into the main focus of attention, and that is the look of fear on the character. Actually, also helps frame a piece as well. If you're a cartoon and comic artist, it's like you can use it as a construction line for character creation. Or if you want to recreate the Last Supper, your own interpretation, you can do that, applying, again, the golden spiral. So the use of golden section in graphic design. Well, if you look at the Apple logo, would it be a surprise to you if I told you that it owes itself entirely Fibonacci sequence? And that is because if you take the Fibonacci sequence and you create a circle inside each of the squares and keep going until you get to the smallest of the squares, and then measure those circles that you created, it gives you all these circles that you can then apply to the design to give it a sense of harmony. And it's all based out of the Fibonacci principle. And that's where your Apple logo comes from. What you're looking at here is another principle called the golden triangle. And I think that slide is just in the wrong position ahead of the title. So the golden triangle is very much an adaptation of the golden ratio and also the golden section. It's a kind of combination of all. You can just about see in black the golden ratio. But what you do is you draw a line from the corner to the top of the horizontal, and then you do the same from that corner to the bottom of this horizontal, and then you draw a line from corner to corner. And what you've done is you've dissected it, and even that dissection can be put to good use. And this really, the golden triangle has left me assuming that if you can do some kind of magical construction, an invisible construction, I'm using a grid or connecting lines, and that makes sense and are not random but mathematically perfect, then anything should work. That's why I think examples of the use of the golden section kind of proves that point. So use of the not the golden section, golden triangle, proves that point. If we look at its use in the arts, look at this painting here, and really, you're kind of thinking, well, I'm not seeing much rule of thirds, although yes, I can see a little bit of that. But what it's really got going for it is how the artist has used it to contain the main elements. It's kind of around the rule of thirds, so kind of golden section, but he's using it as a container so as to isolate the image. And the rest is cascading off. You could argue that this triangle here is kind of like used for the relationship between these two worlds. And the rest of landscape and sky. Degas had an understanding of how to compose through simply creating divisions of space. You can see how a bit of golden section and a bit of rule of thirds and a bit of golden triangle in play at the same time. So use of golden triangle in photography, or even just a simple landscape. Again, it's good to use it as a container for the main focus. And then you've got a secondary focus, and then you've got a third focus. It helps cascade the sense of visual hierarchy. This one is pretty spot on, really. It's using angles to the angles of the golden triangle intersections to add meaning and purpose and harmony to the overall image. So the rule of odds is a principle where the human brain is hot-wired to find odd numbers more attractive, appealing, harmonious than even numbers. We're drawn to always the center of things, and you can't have a center if you don't have something to look at. If it's an even number, the center of things will be a space. If you've got two objects, then what's between them is a gap. So if I take, say, one of these pigeons out of the equation, this isn't a particularly clever picture anymore, because the attention that the eye would normally be drawn to before we start playing clever visual hierarchy experiments with the human eye would always sit in the middle. And if that wasn't enough, the relationship between the two characters is too close to the edge of the page, which makes them look as if they're falling out of the picture, falling out of the frame. So if you put the bird back, all of a sudden it just looks right. It's got that sweet spot. Now, if I show you the grid, what it's doing is it's using the golden section for the position of one of the three birds. That's why that overall composition just looked right. All right, principle number 6, leaving space or adding direction to your shot. We've mentioned this already. Very important in illustration, even more, just as important in graphic design. If we go back to one of our favorite go-to artists, Al Lissitzky, and we talked about his work practically at every lecture that we had. What we didn't really touch on was the sense of direction that the piece has. The triangle, obviously an abstract or kind of motion coming towards the circle, but it's being aided by having the space in which to go into. And that's called adding direction to your overall composition. In many ways, it's like adding space that the object may be moving towards. But the eye always desires to have a clue as to what the object is moving towards. So that's why you leave space. It's the same way that this show jumper is cropped off the frame on the left, but not on the right, because you want to be able to see what's ahead of the object in its inclined direction. It's a really simple principle, and maybe one that you're already familiar with instinctively, and it's called, it's like adding direction or adding space. It's got two names. This is a really good way of adding further drama to a piece by adding negative space. So number 7, balancing elements. What this means is that you take a picture of something and you use the principle of you avoid shooting it in the middle of the shot. You shoot it to the left or the right, but you have an element in the picture that is balancing against it, pulling it back in. It's a bit like the example I showed you on slide 8 this morning, with the big star and then the circle and the square over there, pulling, like the forces of the main image back in on the whole composition, back in the opposite direction, creating an asymmetric balance. So pretty common technique. Take a picture of something or illustrate it, and you accompany it with a secondary element, which is normally smaller in scale and implied further away quite often. But that just gives you an opportunity to play with scale. But what you're doing is you're just creating forces. And it's about the relationship between the elements. So we're touching on a bit of Gestalt here as well from last week. Juxtaposition. The guitarist practicing, but with the pier in the background, it's kind of pulling the balance back into the overall composition. So sometimes it's not just a case of having a landscape. I mean, a landscape can have a hill or a mountain in it. That would be the object that's pulling the balance back. So number 8, leading lines. Now, leading lines is the same as direction, very much so, and leaving space, but it's really more to do with where is the eye being led. What is the journey that the eye is taking? This is a very powerful principle of visual hierarchy. So leading lines in your compositions, whether the graphic design, illustration, or photography, are really important. You take this picture here. The leading lines are the journey over the bridge. So there's a strong line here in the overall composition. So your eye starts really down here and wants to cross the bridge. That's the intention of the photographer. I'm bringing it all into one image. This one's a great example because the lines don't have to be straight, they can be curving. And the eye goes on a journey. The viewer literally, within 6 seconds of looking at this, has traveled down that road because the line is the strongest part of the overall picture. The lines are really important. So number 10, symmetry and patterns. So where there's geometry, where there's symmetry, there's an opportunity to be asymmetrical as well. You take this picture, which is really quite symmetrical, but it's not, because of this bucket is breaking the symmetry of the overall shot and adding interest. So that's using symmetry, but introducing asymmetry to create an anomaly, a visual focus. So number 10, viewpoint. So what I mean by viewpoint is the angle in which you perceive your world. Again, whether it's, this mostly applies to photography and illustration. The viewpoint can add meaning to the overall composition. So whether it's high above the subject, making the subject seem inferior and smaller, or down to the same level, if not lower than the subject, looking up, making the object or subject seem more imposing and more superior. Take this beautiful illustration where the viewpoint is from the level of the dog. What it's doing is it's making the other characters, the dog is of natural scale because you're at its level, but the other characters have now increased tenfold in terms of drama to the overall scene. So that's a really, really useful tip for illustrators, because I do know that you're going to be challenged with the prospect of creating stories and telling stories through illustration. And we go on to framing. Now, framing can apply to illustration, graphic design, photography equally. And what it is, so that you understand the term, it's a bit like, when it's like art directors frame a shot. But that's kind of framing the overall composition when an art director does that with their hands. We're going to be like this. But this context is using the scene to create a frame around central scene, but it's framed to give it a greater sense of importance. That's the best way of putting it. Like this shot here, which is taken in Florence, and the trees are framing the shot, drawing the viewer into the shot through the frame. Take this illustration, it uses framing to add to the story. So, conclusion, but you can wait. But it's not over yet, because there are one or two other things. And that is, this is something that will perhaps appeal, well, it will appeal to both illustrators and graphic designers, but this is really a kind of the graphic designer thing, and that is the use of grids. And how the use of grids, in many ways, is the art of composition to graphic designers. But of course, for every illustrator that has to publish an overall spread, creative spread, they will also need words to back up. And so therefore you've got elements to compose. And that's where grid can come in handy. So I'm just going to quickly take you on a journey of grids and how, depending on the number of grids or columns you have, can play the same, can apply the same effect as most of these principles we've just gone through. So let's just start with the most simple, and that is the one-column grid. Now, classically, the one-column grid is used for textbooks, novels, rather, and there's no kind of composition going on here. At best, it will look like this, by text on the left, image on the right. That's your classic use of the one-column grid. Your two-column grid, however, so that's more pictures of them flicking through the book. Your two-column grid gives you more flexibility, but of course, the downside of a two-column grid is that it doesn't conform to the rule of odds. So the center of the page is where the gutter is. Therefore, that can be fraught with kind of uneasiness and composition nightmares, but it can work to your advantage if you, in terms of overall spreads, because you have a big picture on the left, two-column arrangement on the right. Pretty classic. I know it's got nice bits going on, but it's a pretty classic, typical use of the two-column grid. And there's some more examples where perhaps only one of the pages uses a two-column grid and the other one can go a little bit more freestyle. And then you've got kind of the main illustration breaking across the two, giving direction to the overall piece. And more two-column grids here, this time adding dynamic with angles. And you can do interesting things with just two columns. By increasing the width of margins as well. Three-column grids starts to get a bit more funky because in many ways it's more closely related now to the rule of thirds. So except you're talking about the panels in between the intersecting points for your points of interest. But what it does when you've got an odd number of columns, or really any number of columns more than beyond one column, it doesn't mean that you have to use all your columns. You can use, if it's a three-column grid, you can use two of those columns, reserving part of the overall spread for white space or negative space, or even just a different type of information like a caption to an image. you can get, like much more interesting, as you'll hopefully agree that these spreads just have a greater sense of dynamic, and purely because of we're using a 3-column grid. You can mix up your 3 columns with other column widths. This is where you're only using one of the 3 columns and using the rest of the real estate for either illustration or information. 4 columns. Well, now we go back to an even number, but that doesn't mean that we have to be a slave to the grid. We have composition options. We can use the rule of thirds on the horizontal axis. We can use it in overall composition, but as you notice, this is really rather quite tight because it's using each of the 4 columns. That's not dead sexy, but very pleasant to look at, and looks like, that I'm an important read. This is using 4 columns, but it's using that kind of principle of giving the overall page a focus point, and then you've got cascading page, which is carrying the information. So that's your grid overlaid with that one. And 5-column grids. Now we get back into odd numbers. And again, you don't have to use the columns separately. You can use multiples of. So like, for instance, you're using 3 of the 5 just to create the width of that center column there. This example is using 1, 2, 3 columns, whilst also using 4 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, sorry, in conjunction with each other. And it works really well because this here has been separated from the overall spread in this kind of lozenge effect. There's the grid in play. This one is getting more complicated if you've got a broadsheet. It's like, this is what most newspapers and tabloids are built around, a 5-column grid. 6 columns. 6 columns, as the numbers get higher, the problem behind even numbers gets less, because it means that you don't, as I say, you don't have to use all the columns. You can use them in part, like we've done here. We've got 3 columns of the 6, and we've got 1 column of the 6, and we've got 2 columns of the 6. So that's how flexible that can be. 7 columns, it just very subtle difference to the 6, but again, it can give you lots of flexibility. 9 columns, it gets now even more flexible. 12 columns, I wrote going at some now. You think, well, surely can't get any more columns than 12 columns. And if we did, it would either be reserved for a big broadsheet, or you're using only multiples of the columns. Like this is 1, 2, 3, 4 of the 12 columns, just giving you a different division of the overall page in the same way that rules of composition give you different divisions, as is the case here, where these columns are here measure 3 columns wide. These columns of text. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And when I was at university, I used to study Swiss International Design, which was a school of design which owed its very existence to the invention of the grid. And it's where I really get a lot of my knowledge from during those days of kind of like studying it. I even did my thesis on the subject of Swiss graphic design. During that time, I came across the work of Karl Gerstner. He's featured in my dissertation, and he invented the 24-column grid. And it looked like this. Well, actually, it didn't look like this. This is my interpretation of it. But the thought of 24 columns, what on earth do you need 24 columns for? Well, the nice thing about the number 24 is that it can be divided by on both even and odd numbers in the same way that 12 can be. And because of that, it opens up an infinite, much more infinite option in terms of usage. This is part of my dissertation. And it kind of tells you, it gives you an instruction, go to instruction template. Think of it like a playbook for coming up with really interesting compositions when it comes to graphic design, typography, and this still applies to illustration. It gives me several inset picture sizes. It gives me several column width measures. It gives me headline sizes and everything. It was kind of like, what I did was I battle tested this grid so as to see whether it would fall shy of achieving the objective of creating a harmonious overall composition. So I started putting it to good use by collecting a myriad of interesting photographs, just really nice looking pictures, and saying to myself, I have to put some I have to have a headline, some descriptive information, and I have to have 3 inset on between 3 and 5 inset pictures with captions. That's my mission. And it was the only way to battle test this principle. So that's the 24 column grid. And you'll see how these images that looked randomly placed, if anything, going with the flow of the image. I wanted all these pictures to go with the flow of the overall image. But I also wanted to be a slave to my own 24 column grid. So if I turn it off, it's only when you turn the grid on that you realize that the grid designed it in many ways. I just helped the grid compose it. Same for this one. It looks pretty kind of normal. It's like, but all the decision was made purely based on the grid. Size of the pictures, width of the column width of the main text, and even the headline that goes across the screen. This one here, again, looks like the inset pictures have been placed so as to go with the flow of the snowland caused by the surf border there. But it was put together purely based on the grid. Same again. This shot wanted the inset pictures to climb up the hillside in the area that they could be more easily read. And I let the grid do the decision making for me. Everything conformed to the grid. And this album, well, this image of Katy Perry, I wanted the pictures to kind of like go with the curve of the shot, what size of the pictures, what position, and everything, all decided by this magic grid. Same again, picture of Eiffel Tower. Got some skies, got the vortex going. It's got a viewpoint. It's a great composition in its own right. I wanted to put the sky to good use. That's the only place where the inset pictures had room to go. The grid designed it for me, and so on. So let's now, to finish, revisit the first images that we saw when I asked you, when you look at these images and you think, say, why are they so special? Well, the reason is, and I kind of explained this one along the way, this one is obviously owes itself to the Fibonacci principle golden section. And that's why that explains itself. And I've showed you this work of Pete Mondrian, and now hopefully you have a better understanding of his work. And it's not just a bunch of squares. And I've seen people without any knowledge and understanding of how he created his work to do a poor person's Mondrian, and it's not even a very convincing lookalike, because if you think that this is just a bunch of squares, then you'd be sadly mistaken, because it uses the Fibonacci principle to dictate the size of the squares, the globalization of the golden spiral. The reason why this was in the beginning was not because it's particularly adhering to the rules of composition, but it is abiding to the principle of how to frame a shot to add drama. So the buildings here are framing the subject. This scene out of Game of Thrones owes its entire existence to the golden spiral. And I can show you why by turning it on. So the art director, the DOP, who is the man responsible for composing the shots, deliberately created this epicenter for where the main characters were facing off with the gun in the foreground just there, whilst embracing, that King's Landing in the background, also that other part of the story, living a part of the story. And in filmmaking, what differentiates Wes Anderson from other filmmakers is his kind of use of composition. He's the master of centered composition, but with an asymmetric addition, as is seen here in Grand Budapest Hotel. A lot of his, you could watch a Wes Anderson movie and you could pause it hundreds of times and find an example of a centered composition, but with a break in the symmetry, as is the case with one of the main characters here. But yet the framing of the whole composition is centered. John Ford, the reason I put this at the beginning is because he was a master of giving space to the shot, which we've covered today. He also, to be quite honest, was the very first director who introduced the principle of adjusting the horizon line to be either kind of like hugging the bottom or close to the top, but never in the middle. Never, ever in the middle. And he paved a career out of that. And in doing so, he always created much more drama to the overall composition. The further away from the center, either up or down, that horizon went, the more interesting the overall image became. I mean, this is the most extreme, where it's deflecting that low viewpoint so as to make the characters look more imposing. They're also looking in a direction, giving direction to the overall composition. And then Paul Thomas Anderson, in the director of There Will Be Blood, proposed this scene based purely on the rule of thirds. A better way to get all that information into one scene without wasting space or without losing the impact. And these two postings, designed by Studio Dunbar in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, they in many ways break a lot of the principles. And in many ways I'm showing it because rules can be broken, but from a perspective of knowledge. If anything, what with the angle type, it's still holding on to the principle of the dynamic that you get from things not being squared to the edge of the page. The other thing you could argue that it's getting right is that each one has a focal point. So there's a lesson there to be learned from those who want to go for photo montage or illustrative montage work. And yeah, so they are just beautiful examples of how rules can be broken. So next time you're on holiday or away on a trip, take your camera with you and remember these principles and try to apply them like I did when I took Larry the Lego on holiday. And you'll have some fun with it. But trust me when I say it will enhance your continued appreciation of composition by always being very composition mindful, even when taking pictures. All right, everyone online, I can see that some of you are still here. Thanks for joining us today. I'm just going to stop recording and, or did it stop already? Yeah, stop recording. So that's stopped.